All right, and it looks like we're recording. So welcome everybody to the first webinar of the Astrology Podcast. I'm Chris Brennan, and it is, Saturday, September 13th, 2015 at approximately 1:02 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, where I'm located and Lisa's located. Where is everybody else today? First, Patrick, where are you at?
I'm in Phoenix, Arizona.
And Kelly?
I'm in Orangeville, Ontario in Canada.
Nice. Ben?
Minneapolis, Minnesota.
All right. And Nick?
I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada.
Awesome. So we are coming at you from all over North America, and our seventh panelist, Austin Kopic, will be joining us from, I think, Los Angeles very briefly. So yeah, this is a bit of an experiment. What we're going to do is essentially what we always do with the podcast, which is a discussion about a few different astrological topics, but we're going to do basically a live version of the podcast in front of a live audience with all of us on webcam, sort of having a discussion about a few different topics. And during the course of the show, there's a Q&A box where if you have any questions, you can go ahead and pose them through that Q&A box, and that'll sort of act like a chat room. So, we'll take some questions. We may not take them constantly, and we may not take all of the questions because we have a lot of topics we want to get to. Additionally, if you could stay away from asking just personal questions that are only relevant to your birth chart, that'd probably be a good idea since we probably can't get to those. But if you have a pertinent question about something we're talking about, then go ahead and ask it. And then also towards the very end of this webinar, we'll also open it up to a much more broad Q&A session about any topic. So it doesn't have to be something that we talked about. So if you have something that's more general, save it for later. If you have something that's pertinent to right now, then go ahead and ask it, and we'll see if we can get to it. So let's see, what other intro stuff? So this is a test. This is the first time we've done this. So this is kind of like a proof of concept type thing, or that's how I've pitched it to myself, to see what this format can do and see if it would be good format for doing future discussions like this after this one. So this type of discussion I'm going to start having once a month at the end of each month for the Astrology Podcast. And there'll be different people or different astrologers on the panel each time. And we'll generally just be recapping and talking about and opening up to discussion some of the topics that we already discussed in the Astrology Podcast that month. So this one is going to be free, and then future podcasts are going to be a benefit for people that are subscribing through Patreon at the $5 and $10 tiers. So if you're curious about that, you can just go to the Astrology Podcast website, go to the subscription page, and then you'll see the information about subscribing through Patreon. Let's see, Austin is messaging me and says that he needs the link, so give me just a second. Okay. Does somebody else want to say any introductory things? Oh, wait, there's Austin.
There he is. He may not realize he's on camera immediately.
Okay, Austin is cleaning his house at the moment or something.
Where's
wearing
Neptune
pants.
right now?
Pants are confirmed.
Pants are confirmed.
Thank goodness it's not you, Patrick.
Right, yeah, indeed. It would be so much worse if it was me.
Okay. Hello, can you hear us?
Austin,
I'm loving Neptune.
Jupiter opposite Neptune.
Yeah, and I made that the ruler of the ascendant. I'm realizing this is one of the drawbacks with the Jupiter rising elections that I've recommended for this month, is you have that close Jupiter-Neptune opposition.
Totally. Yeah. It's always Neptune that gets forgotten.
Right. All right. So he's getting piped in still. So in terms of introduction, since everybody's here, I think we can start doing that. So let's see. Let's go ahead and just briefly introduce ourselves and mention each of our websites. So first, I'm Chris Brennan, and my website is chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Lisa?
I'm Lisa Scheim, and my website is lisascheim.com.
Patrick?
My name is Patrick Watson, and my website is at www.patrickwatsоnastrologer.com.
All right, Patrick and I are the only two that weren't quick enough to bookmark our own domain names, and so we had to add astrologer to it. Kelly?
I'm Kelly Surtees, and my new website is Kelly's Astrology, so with an S in there. That's all you need. Yeah. I do have my URL, my name as well, but that's what I'm using now.
That's good. Ben?
My name is Ben Dykes, and my website is bendykes.com. For some reason,
Excellent.
there wasn't a lot of demand for that name. So.
Yeah. Damn, all of you guys with unique names. So Nick?
My name is Nick Dagan Best, and my website is nickdaganbest.com.
And finally, Austin.
My name is Austin Kopic, and my website is austinkopic.com.
All right. All right. Well, welcome, everybody.
We've got very creative names, clearly.
Yeah, I'm really jealous of all of you for search engine purposes. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. First, technical thing, if anybody wants to, you can switch back and forth between just viewing the person who's talking right now versus seeing the entire panel at the same time. All you have to do is click the button in the top right of the video window that says either gallery view or speaker view, and it'll toggle back and forth whoever's currently speaking or everybody. So so let's go ahead and get started and jump into some of our topics right away. So let's see. Our first topic is going to be talking about the astrological weather a little bit. And first we want to start with a little post-mortem or a recap of the recent Venus retrograde, since it recently stationed direct. And we wanted to talk a little bit about what we learned from it and some of the notable things that happened. Does one of you, I think especially either Austin and Kelly, want to, or Nick even, does any of you have a specific point or thing that you observed about the Venus retrograde that happened this summer that really stood out for you?
First of all, I want to say that this is reminding me of one of the opening scenes of Monty Python's Holy Grail, when there's someone carting around a trail of corpses, and someone's trying to put a corpse on the thing, and the person says, "I'm not dead," and the point being, it ain't over. Venus retrograde is not post-mortem. We've had a direct station, so there is a shift in the direction. It is starting to become over, to put it one way. But, until about the second week of October, we're still in the sway of things, and if anything, a lot of stuff is going to surface now that has only just been sort of bubbling over the course of the actual retrograde.
I'd like to add to that, Nick. Do you know about the timing of the U.S. military's decision about whether to open up all ground forces positions to women?
No, go ahead, bring that up.
Okay. That's been happening. They've been evaluating that question all summer long, and it was right around the Cazimi, or the inferior conjunction of Venus, when two women made it through the U.S. Ranger School, which is an elite forces position for the first time in history. So that was the event people talked about, but it was data that they're going to use to make a decision on the first week of October.
Wow. Brilliant.
Exactly your time frame.
Yeah. I'd say, over and over, the things in this retrograde, this part of the retrograde phase, as it goes back through the last degrees, especially with the summer retrograde, it tends to be a big one. 24 years ago, it was Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, both of whom were born with Venus retrograde, and that whole hearing, which was really just over a couple of days, and yet had this enormous and very Venus retrograde-esque sort of impact on politics and the culture. That occurred after the direct station. There'll be a lot of things like that that are sort of, that have been bubbling under, like you described, that only just sort of come into view at this point. But
so one of the things that we talked about, I guess, in our podcast on Venus retrograde, Nick, is just that you view the retrograde cycle as like a 90 to 100 day period that includes both the pre-retrograde build-up shadow phase as well as the post-retrograde shadow phase. So really what you're saying is we're not out of the retrograde because we still have, another 20 or 30 days left?
Yeah, 30 days effectively, or 20-something days now.
Okay.
30 days after the direct station is a fair yardstick to use.
Sure. So we still have some things coming up. One of the things I think that was really notable, because we talked about it as the Venus retrograde was getting started at the beginning of the summer, especially Austin and Kelly and I did, in terms of, in the United States, at least, gay marriage being legalized by the Supreme Court around the time of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction, and there being a lot of optimism surrounding that. But then realizing, or one of the things that we knew and noticed and kind of predicted or called, was that when Venus stationed direct, it would be conjunct Mars. So there was the potential for some sort of strife or some sort of conflict surrounding what had otherwise looked a little bit more optimistic earlier in the very start of the retrograde period. And more recently, it's been interesting seeing how that seems to have coincided with this clerk from Kentucky becoming a national story because she refused to authorize marriage certificates, and then it became sort of a big debacle or a big controversy. So Austin, though, I think pointed out that this is something that was developing even since the beginning of the retrograde period, I think.
Yeah, the Economist ran a story during, I believe, the first week of August, might have been the second week of August, that detailed that a number of clerks in the, I think it was mostly in the southern United States, were refusing to issue marriage licenses, but they were doing it in a way that was legal, where they were actually denying marriage certificates to everybody. The way that they could keep their job was to deny them to all couples and to just not issue them at all. And so that was happening at least a month before this. What's her name? Kim Wells, is it? But this whole controversy about the woman going to jail in protest. And so we didn't hear about that. But
so there was kind of a build-up before it culminated in like a sort of national story with one person.
Right. You have the symbol. It didn't come to consciousness. There was no appearance that spoke to the masses before the recent controversy, but it was totally happening.
Yeah, and I mean, that brings up an interesting point that Ben and I talked about on a podcast a year ago, which is this issue where sometimes, even though it's like the astrology says something, sometimes a person may not be aware of it, or especially in mundane events, it may not be something that's being reported on nationally, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening. I think Zoller had like a saying about that, or something to that effect, at least when it came to natal charts, that we talked a little bit about. Right, Ben? Or do you remember what that saying was that Zoller? I mean, it wasn't the saying so much as it was like an assertion on his part that basically if the astrologer sees something, it seems very clear, and the person denies it, Zoller tried to allege that the person would be lying or something like that.
Yeah, that was more about the sociology of talking to astrology groups and people who want to put up their chart and have it read publicly but aren't prepared for what the astrologer is going to see.
Right. And you had a specific like anecdote or like experience with that at one point, didn't you?
I've had a couple of those.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you want to go into it, but so that this is an interesting example of that in terms of Austin started picking up on some of that. It was showing up in the news a little bit, but oftentimes when it comes to mundane movements and transits like this, sometimes there's things happening in the undercurrents of society that you only see the sort of very tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So another one that was like that was kind of reported in the news, but you kind of got the sense that there was a lot more going on privately that we weren't aware of. Was it started very early on in the summer during the course of the early part of the Venus retrograde, but it was when the website Ashley Madison was hacked. And this is like a website where people would sign up evidently in order to cheat, or in order to have like relationships outside of their marriage. Supposedly, and apparently a lot of people had signed up for it, a lot of men had signed up for it, and then the database was hacked and then dumped publicly, so that a lot of people's basically like affairs suddenly became public during the course of the summer. And I've been interested in this throughout the course of the summer because it's sort of been a developing story, but more recently, Venus retrograde stationing direct conjunct Mars, there's been a few notable stories of several men actually committing suicide, evidently, that have been directly tied to this, including, I think, one pastor or one like Christian pastor or something like that.
There was also the revelation from all this, which makes it all the more tragic, was that there were very few women who were actually signed up to Ashley Madison. Like the ratio of men to women was like complete. I mean, it was pretty much all men using it. So the whole thing's imaginary. What was mostly revealed was a bunch of men who had signed on to a website with the hope of cheating. There may not have actually been any real cheating going on. There weren't the numbers to sustain any sort of significant amount of extramarital conduct.
In fact, men were even being hired to pose as women on the site.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
so these whatever the outcome, be it suicide or even just sort of some ruined marriages where that could have had promise, it was all over something that was an illusion. That was all just sort of
in their mind. Yeah.
Sure.
Crazy. I just had one addition on the Venus-Mars, the station conjunct Mars. In Australia, in the news in the last 7 to 10 days has been a huge focus on violence against women, because there's been a couple of really tragic domestic violence or family violence deaths. And this, interestingly, has been building, would have been over the winter in Australia over the last few months, where there's been a case here or there that's really put the spotlight on violence against women. And it's exploded in the last week with a particularly sad case about a young mum in Queensland in Australia who was really horrifically killed by her ex-partner. So just in terms of the more difficult side, which we had speculated with this Mars component, I think Austin alluded to potentially a more positive version of that with the women in the military, but there has been, coming out of Australia, sort of a more sad story, although it has really galvanised press attention and attention from the politicians to really, get more funding and that type of thing to help women in these difficult situations.
Sure. So that's an interesting, I don't know. I mean, one of the distinctions that has just been interesting in terms of sometimes the retrograde station being a little bit more positive because the planets it was configured with initially when it started to go retrograde versus things being a little bit more challenging or negative towards the end of the retrograde with its stationing conjunct more difficult planets. So I'm not sure if that's a general principle then we might draw from and sort of use in the future for this retrograde, but it was kind of an interesting one that seemed to work in this context. So it looks like, so people, I guess, can't see the gallery view, so it's only single people being highlighted on the webcam. So that's fine, but sorry about that if we referred to the gallery view a few times.
We have a few Q&A questions. Just letting people, because I haven't been checking, but there's a few more just to be aware of.
Sure. So yeah, I didn't see some of those at first. Let's see. Are there any that look really good, pertinent?
There was one great one here from somebody asking about the shadow phase of Venus retrograde and how it's different from the rest of Venus retrograde. I feel like that should go to Nick.
Sure. Do you feel like there's a distinction between the actual retrograde period versus the shadow phase, Nick?
Maybe you could define what the shadow phase is too, Nick.
Yeah, okay, let's start with that. Essentially, the shadow phase, I mean, that's a fairly recent term, but what I like about the term is it still describes the period of time that I'm looking at. Whether or not we should be calling it a shadow phase is another question. The period during which Venus is actually retrograde lasts about 40 days. And in those 40 days, Venus will have gone backward through the tropical zodiac, about 15 tropical zodiacal degrees. Now, in the 30 days prior to those 40 days, and then again in the 30 days following those 40 days, Venus is going to be tracing these 15 zodiacal degrees. Beforehand, it'll be traveling through them prior to the retrograde when it's going to go backward, and then afterwards, obviously, it follows through those degrees once again. For this reason, they're referred to as shadow periods. Now, what I always see in studying these periods is that there's a shift. If you're studying a given narrative, be it sort of these socio-political questions of women in the U.S. Rangers or violence against women in Australia, Another one is prison riots, which has been very big both in Australia and in the United States this summer. Or in just the lives of individual people whose horoscopes are really strongly configured to these Venus retrogrades. What happens is over the period of these 100 days, the pace of their narrative shifts from the shadow period to the retrograde to the afterwards. Now, beyond that, people come up with very creative descriptions to distinguish between these periods, and I'm not sure they always sort of apply. I did a recent podcast episode on the subject, and there's still the question of, is Venus a warrior goddess as a morning star and an evening star? There's many different ways to contextualize it. So I try to avoid being that broad or general, and really just to state that it's not unlike studying a lunar phase in that you're detecting shifts in the properties of the planet and the way they relate to each other. And that's really the best way to put in a blanket context.
And I just remembered I can share screen, and I meant to do that more in order to like utilize that as an ability so that when people are talking, like on the podcast, to be able to throw up diagrams and things. So can everybody see the shadow phase diagram?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome.
I would like to add one thing to that.
Sure.
On a very simple note, during that post-retrograde shadow period, it's your third time around. The planet has literally already been through those degrees twice. It's not the, oh my God, it's something totally new, right? It's literally like if you've got a planet in the in the blast radius, like you've already had two conjunctions. And so unless you don't pay any attention at all to your life, you shouldn't be shocked when it comes up again.
That's right.
Sure, that makes sense. All right. So, and then the last, one other relevant question was, Abigail Smith asks, do you predict that the Kim Davis thing will be resolved in the first week of the October range, i.e. this debacle Venus retrograde thing, or is it bigger? And I'm not sure if it's tied into bigger things or if for her it will continue, but I would expect that some of the things that started towards the beginning of the Venus retrograde won't be fully resolved until we pass the Venus retrograde shadow, which does end in early October. So I am expecting at least some of the drama surrounding some of that will die down after that point, or at least that's my personal assumption.
I would actually think that it probably would continue, or at least this would be remembered as a pretty big moment, not just because of Venus, but also because on the day Kim Davis was born, she was born very close to the exact conjunction of Uranus and Pluto, and the Uranus-Pluto square is pretty much in effect, and a lot of Uranus-Pluto people have come to the fore, those people born in 1965. The leader of Syria, he was born with the sun conjunct Uranus and Pluto, and he's at the center of the Syrian civil war. And so I think this, the people who are coming up now from the mid 60s, I think that, they're going to stick around a little bit. I think the immediate drama might die down with her, but she might be kind of called upon, as some sort of, figurehead or martyr or what have you for her cause in her eyes.
Or possibly establishing a pattern of protest that is copied.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also, Patrick and I both looked up Kim Davis's chart, and she has, say, at least a good 2/3 of her chart in mutable. So, so the Saturn going back into Sag, it's going to light up most of her chart. So in addition to that Uranus-Pluto, she's got Mercury tightly configured with that Uranus-Pluto, but all of the mutable stuff's going to keep getting hit for the next couple of years.
And the eclipse we just had was also very close to all of her placements in Virgo as well.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have her birth data? I could enter it in and throw it up just very briefly.
September 17th?
17th, yeah.
Yeah, 1965.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Is there a time at all or a place for her, or just the day?
She was born in Rowan County, where she's living right now, and the city Moorhead is there. I thought that was close enough.
Yeah, I mean, since we don't have a time or anything, I think just an approximate location and just noon time is sufficient. So here is the chart. Let's see. right there. Okay, there's the chart. And there's what you guys are pointing out, and Lisa was just pointing out in terms of all of the mutable placements. So what were you saying about that, Lisa?
Oh, just that I think that, things probably will shift to some degree once Venus goes out of the shadow, but she's still got Saturn hitting all of that mutable in her chart. So I think that in one way or another, whether she's in the media eye directly or not, will still be dealing with this for a while in some way or another.
Well, and one of the things I wonder is, like, remember, for example, like another recent example, and I mean, I'm not picking that example on purpose, but just because it might be relevant. But remember, like, Sarah Palin, for example, was huge, like in 2008, and that was probably the most popular and the most notoriety she'd ever had was when she was picked as McCain's running mate, and for that few month period or that year period around then. But after that, she continued to be like a public figure and continued to come up periodically, but she never quite was as prominent or popular as that one time where she was sort of in the spotlight for that 15 minutes. But yeah, the general point that you guys are making makes sense in terms of everything she has is in mutable signs, except for the only planets that she doesn't have in mutable signs are all in Scorpio, which is where Saturn is transiting out of and departing from right now. So, okay. Well, we might want to move on to some other topics. So our next topic is also a little bit more pertinent in terms of right now, which is the eclipse, since we just went into an eclipse month, and we just had our first eclipse today in Virgo, and then we have another eclipse, a lunar eclipse, coming up in Aries in just a few days from now. And Kelly, I think you actually are doing something on eclipses pretty soon, right?
No, I'm doing something in Sag, but
okay.
I can always talk about eclipses. I don't think I am, unless I've forgotten that I'm doing something.
I thought you said you were doing like a webinar on eclipses later today or something. Maybe I mixed it up with something else.
That's okay.
Yeah. So does anybody have any comments on either? Because I wanted to mention, doesn't just have to be temporal about this eclipse right now and what its meaning is, but just the nature of eclipses in general, either as an interpretive or timing thing that happens in natal charts or just in the world in general. Ben, I know you've been doing a lot of work in eclipses and mundane astrology lately, especially with like World War I and stuff, right?
Yeah, and I'm finding that important degrees in the chart of the eclipse, either the degree of the eclipse or the ascendant of the eclipse or the lord of the ascendant or lord of the eclipse, that in the case of World War I, it's easy to see close connections between those degrees and the degrees of what are called the mean conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter. So that certain eclipses, might have a meaning on their own, but if an eclipse has a close relationship to a mean conjunction, then there's going to be a close relationship between the period of that eclipse and what the meaning of that 20-year period or 200-year period is. And so that was true in the case of the 1912 eclipse. It was a total eclipse, went across Europe, and that eclipse also had a close relationship with the nativity of Franz Ferdinand, the man who was then assassinated in Sarajevo, as everyone knows.
Okay,
so there's a way to look at we can connect a normal eclipse to a nativity, but we can also eclipse it to or connect it to larger mundane trends as well through the use of Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions.
Okay. And sometimes, the implication, I guess, with the Franz Ferdinand chart is that sometimes if there's a natal chart, especially of an important person that is somehow tied into the eclipse, then somehow that ties him into broader themes that affect the world in general, or like the mundane world in general.
Yeah. His life, maybe that native's life will have a broader effect, or maybe some mundane events will have a particular influence on the native's life, even if they don't become, say, famous,
I know this is something that, go ahead, sorry.
That the course of their life will be closely connected to mundane trends.
Okay.
That's kind of interesting. I noticed a similar pattern with, for example, presidential candidates. They often have the nodes crossing the degrees of their ascendant or their sun or their moon, and that's usually tying them into this broader, event which is happening, which is, a presidential race. And I haven't done this for all of candidates this time, but I know that the last time it was very interesting to see how even the times that they announced had the nodes in these very prominent places across the ascendant, or culminating on the midheaven. So I've noticed that too, that the nodes seem to bring at least certain nativities seem to bring them into part of these broader stories, narratives, trends, things that are going on in the world.
Right, and that was actually one of the interpretive principles we used in the 2012 election, which was, I think it was Obama had an eclipse in his first house in the 2008 election, and then he had an eclipse in his 10th house in the 2012 election, right, Patrick?
That's correct. That's where the nodes have been moving. So it's kind of interesting to kind of, well, we won't get into that because that's a different story about this election. But I've seen, at least with the charts that I've examined so far, that the nodes, especially as they move into Virgo, will be that will affect a lot of the candidates who have some of these mutable placements.
And that's actually an important interpretive principle that you really think is an important, right, Austin, in terms of the connection between the eclipses and the nodes is something that people don't think about, but is actually really crucial and integral to understanding how they should be interpreted, right?
Absolutely. It's something that I complain about a lot. Right. Is that, the reason that human beings calculated the positions of the nodes is they could predict eclipses. Because when you can't predict eclipses and they happen every several years, it's terrifying. Literally, that's why we have the nodes. They're points of they're points of more perfect alignment between the sun, moon, earth system, right? And they're not always occupied, but they always exist. And just their simple definition of being these points of more perfect alignment speaks to the interpretive principle that y'all were just talking about, which is, it's more relevant, it matters. Things are aligned, you are more in line with the collective, with the events of the world, of the mundus, right? That's what the nodes are. They are points of alignment between all three worlds.
Right.
All three realms.
And so, just to slightly belabor the point that the nodes and the eclipses are connected, that's where the root significance of the roads is from eclipse symbolism. That's why they're the head and the tail of the dragon. That's why that's where all of the stuff in Vedic astrology, which influenced a fair amount of stuff during the Arabic period, and Ben can tell you a lot more about that. The node, you can't really get to know the nodes without looking at eclipses, because we get eclipses first, we figure out these points that are potential eclipses, and then we realize that they matter even when there's not an eclipse happening. And so if you're interested in the nodes and you haven't connected them to eclipses yet, it'll help you make sense of the symbolism. And even if you're doing something, very modern, like evolutionary astrology, all this talk about souls emerging out of the darkness between lives and trajectory and all that, that's all eclipse talk. That's all weird, giant absences and things disappearing into absence or emerging out of absence. So that's all I'll say for now.
All right. And one person's asking about, no, sorry, I wasn't sure what the transition should be there. That was actually really interesting. And we should probably do an entire show on that. I think you've wanted to do one for a while, right, Austin, in terms of eclipses and the nodes and the connection between that, but also not just symbolically, but also in terms of timing and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I just think it's an important part of astrology that seems to not be taught very thoroughly, just based on what I get.
True.
And it's really not that hard.
Oh, go ahead, Kelly.
I was just going to say one very current example, and this speaks to one of the questions about if a solar eclipse is within 5 degrees of a natal planet, what might it mean for you? And I didn't come up with this. I didn't spot this. It was on Kate Petty's Facebook page about Serena Williams in the tennis. She got beaten for the first time in a major this year, and her moon in her chart is at 20 degrees Virgo, which is exactly where this solar eclipse is. I'm not necessarily saying absolute direct cause and effect, but certainly a very interesting synchronicity there. So that was a very tight conjunction of that solar eclipse on her moon, and it turned out to be a little bit unfortunate for her.
So what, in terms of interpretive principles, Kelly or anyone else, what makes it so that an eclipse is going to be important for a person? Let's say if you just had a list of like the top few things, like let's say 3 things that make an eclipse important or personally relevant in a person's life, what would you say that those are?
If they were born close to an eclipse themselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because that's establishing a life pattern. I mean, not to say that if you weren't born close to an eclipse that they wouldn't be important for you, but I think anytime you have the sun and moon in an angular position to the nodes, that's a nativity which is going to be set up to correspond with that cycle. So that would be one of the first things.
Okay, Watson, I'd like to speak to that because that's what got me interested in the eclipse. In the eclipses, I have both the sun and moon configured to the nodes. I was born 1 week after a solar, 1 week before a lunar, and other stuff. But when I was in college, many years ago, when I was 21 years old, one night I was feeling very strange, and I tried to draw out my feelings. And what I drew was a sun with its rays being blocked. The sun was supposed to be shining on the solar plex of the figure, but the rays were being blocked, and so there was a weird darkness there. What I found out was that in Australia, on the other side of the world, while I was drawing that, there was a solar eclipse happening. And so I was like, oh, maybe there's something. This was actually before I was into astrology. And so I was like, oh, so that's maybe there's something to solar eclipses. And then I get into astrology later, and I find out that I'm one of those Bardo babies, one of the people born between 2 eclipses.
So
Bardo baby, I love the sound of that.
Yeah, that was a great coining of that term, Austin.
I've been using that for years. I'm glad that makes sense to you guys.
No, that is a band name.
Is that going to be the next pop astrology thing, like the Saturn return and the Mercury?
Next hashtag.
What does it mean?
To be a
Are you
Bardo.
a Bardo baby millennial?
Oh gosh.
So the next thing that would make an eclipse important, I imagine, is if it aspects something in a given chart as well. I mean, and that's probably one of the first things people would. No, just getting us back to the question.
Yeah. Good.
So so I showed the chart for the solar eclipse, and then here I'll share the chart for the lunar eclipse really quickly so that we have everything, especially in terms of the recording. So there's the lunar eclipse, which weirdly, because the node is like right on the cusp of Libra or the north node is on the cusp of Libra and Virgo, we've got the solar eclipse taking place in Virgo, but then the lunar eclipse oddly taking place in Aries, which is a sign that's disjunct or inconjunct from where the solar eclipse is taking place. So this is the chart for the lunar eclipse that'll take place in a couple of weeks.
It may work differently with nativities, but one principle in traditional mundane is that the more total the eclipse is, the more important it is.
Yeah.
So the eclipse we just had was, or was it today, is a partial. And I think this goes back to Ptolemy. To the extent that the luminary is eclipsed, that would show the level of, oomph or an intensity that it has, which may be more relevant for mundane and not so much for nativities.
Okay. Yeah, Jeff Dobbs actually in the questions section asked about that. So you would say that a full eclipse is more important and more significant than a partial eclipse?
A total or maybe an annular.
An annular.
Yeah. Annular, if people don't know what that is, it comes from the Latin word for a ring. It's when you have you have what would be a total eclipse of the sun, but the moon is just close enough that you can see a ring of light around her. She's just a tiny bit smaller than the sun, and so it looks like a ring of light.
Okay. All right. And Austin, were you about to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that it's really safe to universalize that principle that the more of an eclipse it is, the more of an eclipse it is. If you're looking for the meaning, if it's, if the partial versus an annual or a total, of course the total is going to mean more on a personal level as well. I don't think that's something which skewed.
I mean, we're talking about degrees of light. How much light is it showing? Like that makes a lot of sense.
Or how much light is blocked if it's an eclipse too, right? And so the more dramatic, the tighter the eclipse. And I guess to throw in a really brief technical comment is that, as I understand it, an eclipse will be any new or full moon that happens within 18 degrees of the nodal axis. So you can have these tiny little slither eclipses where the new or full moon might be 16 degrees away from the nodal axis. But the closer the new or full moon is to the nodal axis itself, that's when you get that total or that annular eclipse, and the more powerful.
I thought it was only 14 degrees. I didn't know it was 18.
Okay, yeah.
I didn't know if that was right or not. Maybe I was wrong.
Well, one of us, we can double check.
All right.
Let me ask your thoughts. How do you folks distinguish between eclipses that happen close to a south node as opposed to those that happen close to a north node?
So typically you focus on where the moon is, right? So in a full moon or a lunar eclipse, you look at which end of the nodes the moon is on. I would, anyway. I don't know if maybe I'm doing it in an odd Kelly way. No. I think that the typical theory, and correct me if I'm wrong or throw in your 2 cents, is that north node is generally about the pushing forward or the breaking of new ground, whereas the south node perhaps has got something a little bit more to do with either an ending or the past in some way. But that could be a bit of a modern spin.
I arrived at very similar interpretive principles myself, Kelly. In that
my fellow Bardo baby.
Yeah, I was born a week after Kelly. So she was born on the solar eclipse, and I was born halfway between the solar and the lunar in 79. So I guess what I do, and I just taught a brief class on this yesterday, so it's fresh-ish, is you look at the theme sign. Right?
Did we lose him?
Yeah, we're losing you, Austin. Are you on Wi-Fi?
Yes, I'm on Wi-Fi. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Go ahead. Start over like 10 seconds ago.
Okay, so what I was going to say is, so you take the themes that the north node in one sign and the south node in the other sign in your chart are going to push forward over a year and a half, right? So then the eclipses are going to be the big moves along that theme. They're going to be roughly an average of 3 sets of eclipses during that year and a half, right? So you have this theme in the background, that's the nodes, the eclipses move it forward. And so what the nodes represent is this push-pull back and forth, which will eventually kind of rebalance an area or move energy and stuff from one side to another. And there's a subtractive side to that and an additive side, which are the south node and the north node. And so I see the south node, eclipses on the south node as being helping us to let go of something. And if it's on the solar, if it's the solar south node, then it's letting go of a priority of something that we see with our intellect or something that we had previously selected. And if it's the south node lunar, then a lot of times it's letting go of stuff. A lot of times you have problems with material things on south node lunars. I see those to be the most materially damaging. And the North Node solars, like we've just had, usually see an emergence of a new priority. Again, if they're solar and they deal with the spirit and the vision and the intelligence and our capacity for selection and intention, a lot of times people discover that they really want something new, or they're like, this is really important, I'm going to push this further. And then the North Node on the moon generally have to do with providing more energy or substance happening. So I guess I read 4 kinds, right? North, south, solar, lunar. And that's really not a very difficult typology.
No, well, that's really good.
Sorry, that was a bit of a monologue.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
That was great. I did some reference checking, Patrick.
Oh, yes.
So I'm just quoting now from Predictive Astrology, because actually there's a middle ground between what we were both saying. Oh. So this is Bernadette Brady's Predictive Astrology. It's got all the Saros series info in it. She said,
I wanted to get that book.
My God, it's brilliant. A new moon occurring within 18 degrees of the north or south can be a partial solar eclipse. But for lunar eclipses, the maximum orb is about 12 degrees. Oh. So she talks about some variance depending on whether it's a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse. So
I see.
Interesting.
All right.
I actually did not pick that up when I've read this book before. So now everybody knows.
And Lisa, I think you were going to address one of the questions.
Yeah, I just saw one of the questions actually asking about orb as well, but I think it was meaning what is the orb that you use for eclipses in terms of someone's chart? And I don't know about the rest of you, but I have noticed that they do tend to be stronger when the eclipse degree itself is close to one of the personal planets or an angle, but also when the nodes, even if the nodes are not at that degree, so the eclipse, say, is happening, 10 degrees off or something, but the nodes themselves at the time of the eclipse are on one of those personal planets or angles. And I don't have a specific number of degrees orb in mind, but I've found that either of those can be really important. But I would say even just in the house themselves, like you were saying, Austin, it does set up an ongoing theme for about 1.5 years in these 2 opposing houses in someone's chart. So I personally don't worry about orb too much. You could see it maybe more strongly when it's closer in degree, but definitely within that, I always tell people within that 1.5 years, those 2 themes are going to move forward and change is going to happen more quickly than you were expecting perhaps in those areas.
Absolutely. I generally use a whole sign or sort of co-presence rule of thumb for eclipses. Like, it's in Virgo. If you've got things in Virgo, it matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. And that's definitely true for the houses as well. Just the topics oftentimes associated with the houses that those eclipses fall in will become much more prominent in the person's life during that 6-month period. And that's especially true if that house is activated in other ways, like, for example, by annual perfection that year. So if you're in a 7th house perfection year and then you have an eclipse in the 7th house, you're going to have some important developments taking place in that 6-month period with respect to relationships.
Right.
So that's one example. So let's see. Are there any other points that anybody wanted to make, or any questions that people wanted to address before we move on from this section of the show on eclipses? No?
There's one question that I think I can address very briefly that's on the Q&A.
Okay, shoot.
So Barb Hinley asks, but the solar eclipse is on the North Node. Isn't that supposed to be about gain and moving forward? I would just say this is the first eclipse on the North Node Virgo side in a series. And so it's about the emergence of a whole 1.5 year trajectory. You don't get rewards. The story, and so because it's solar, the sun is about seeing and intending. And so what I would look for is the emergence of new priorities or projects that will then probably characterize the action of the next 1.5 years as far as that sign and house are concerned.
Sure. All right. Awesome. So, so I think in order, just because we have limited amount of time, just to keep this moving, we'll have to move on. And then if we can circle around towards the end of the show and come back to some of the questions, we will. So the last sort of astrological weather thing that we wanted to address before we talk about some other stuff is just the upcoming ingress of Saturn into Sagittarius, which is actually taking place really soon. I think this Thursday, the 17th, right? So we're about to record a full 2-hour podcast on this on Tuesday that's going to have discussions between me and Kelly and Austin and Lisa and Patrick. So we're not going to go into it a lot here, but we did want to mention just a few points as sort of like a preview for that upcoming podcast and in order to show off a few charts. So Saturn is ingressing into Sagittarius, and then it's going to stay there until the end of 2017. So we're talking about a 2 or 2.5 year transit that's about to begin for everybody. And let me see, just to give a preview of our discussion, Kelly, since now this is the thing that you're specializing in or doing soon, what are some like really good points that people need to know about that, or pertinent things would you like to mention as a sort of preview to our fuller discussion on Tuesday?
On Saturn moving into Sag, sorry, Chris, just on that topic generally.
Right.
I want to, I'm like, how will I condense my thoughts? One thing that I keep coming back to, and this is a little bit of a steal, I think, from sort of more medieval ideas, is the concept of Saturn as a cold, dry planet. It's a kind of a melancholic energy in its intrinsic nature, and it's so cold and dry. Saturn has been in cold and wet Scorpio for the last couple of years, and cooling and wetness is slowing, and it's that deep emotional intensity. It's kind of almost been an exacerbated thing with Saturn in Scorpio, like do the Scorpio stuff and do it really deeply and really intensely. And so the big qualitative change of Saturn going into Sag is that it's moving out of a wet place and a cold place and moving into a hot place and a dry place. There's this, like an alcoholic might go to rehab to dry out. And so when things dry out, they become a little bit more crisp, a little bit more linear, a little bit more focused. And because Saturn is intrinsically quite cold, I'm really intrigued by this idea of Saturn going into a warm sign or a hot sign. Fire signs and air signs have this heat to them. So that kind of is a bit of a prelude to something Austin said in a podcast we did a little while ago, which is about Saturn in Sag having to do with movement and having to do with things being acted upon, things that have been a bit stuck in the mud with Saturn in Scorpio. It's like the sun's coming out after a massive thunderstorm and all of a sudden progress is possible. So that is a really nice theme, I think, generally for people to keep in mind, that there's movement at the station, which is, to quote a very famous Australian poem, things that have been stuck or solid or frozen are melting and getting going again.
Awesome.
I don't know if that makes sense for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that ties into some themes, just in terms of, I mean, one of the things that we came back to and we've talked about a few times on the forecast episode is that there was almost like a little preview of some of those themes that you were just talking about earlier this year when Saturn first dipped into Sagittarius between late December of 2014 and mid-June of 2015. And then it retrograded back into Scorpio for the entirety of the summer for one last trip into that, remind us all of whatever that transit was about in each of our lives personally. But then it's going full steam back into Sagittarius starting in just a few days here. So Austin, did you have any like general thoughts about Saturn and Sagittarius as sort of like a preview to our upcoming discussion that you just wanted to share to sort of encapsulate what that's about for you?
I have a lot of general thoughts and some specific ones. I don't know if I can encapsulate it. I'll hook into the things moving forward theme that Kelly was talking about. Saturn and Sag has a lot to do, so Sagittarius is probably the symbolism directly speaks to speed or movement. It's a man horse bottom. The only thing a horse bottom is good for, other than like mythological bestiality, is moving fast, right? And
yeah,
so,
the power and the speed.
I hope that doesn't become a Twitter hashtag.
Yeah, I'm going to do it right now.
Okay.
So, you know, and what I noticed when I went down to Saturn Sagittarius, when I went down to the bottom of the year, which I'm imagining is lower than the top of the year, winter, I noticed that there was this really strong, go really fast, like mandatory speed and stoplights in people's lives. If Saturn is time, and time can be measured or understood as a rhythm, it's sort of like the drummer doing a different beat. And Saturn Sag was really fast, like blast beats. And then there would just be a stop sign. And I would see people like go really, really, really fast and then just get stuck, and go really, really fast and then get stuck. Just sort of a rhythm. It has that quality. I really kind of want to tell a brief story about the day of Saturn's ingress to Sag. Is that okay?
Yeah, go nuts.
Okay. So the day of Saturn's ingress into Sagittarius, which I believe was December 23rd, my fiance and I were driving to San Francisco to spend the holidays with some friends. And I was like, oh, it's interesting. This is the day of the ingress. I wonder what'll happen. And so we got a call from the person we were going to stay with. And he was like, oh, I've got some issues. I'm going to be in the emergency room. We kept getting more calls. And then by the time we got there, he had one foot which had just bloated up to a crazy degree, and he couldn't walk on it. And there was this grumpy man on one crutch that I saw instead of the normal image of my friend. So he had taken on this image that you see in all sorts of Renaissance depictions of Saturn, which is the guy who's grumpy and lame in one leg with one crutch. And that was the day of Saturn's ingresses matter. And
sure
just to speak to movement speed, right? His movement speed was greatly decreased.
Sure. That the movement speed actually has symbolic meaning in terms of the actual experience of the event.
Yeah, like literally he was slow now. It would be, I'd kick his ass at a race.
Right. All right. So
any of us would, I think.
So those are two of our Saturn and Sagittarius panels that'll be on the podcast on Tuesday. And Austin and Kelly are really good at giving sort of like the broad overall, especially like mundane view of like what this means for everybody. And then the other half of that is going to be talking with and interviewing Lisa and Patrick, who specialize both in doing that, but also looking more at what Saturn and Sagittarius means, both in terms of a natal placement, but also what it means when a person, for example, is having an important Saturn transit, like a Saturn return, that's activating a natal Saturn and Sagittarius placement. So both of them had a few charts that they wanted to share just really briefly as really good examples that kind of encapsulate some of what Saturn and Sagittarius is about from a natal perspective. Let's see. So, Lisa, why don't we start with your example, your primary example, which I think is David Good, right?
Sure. Yeah. So my first example is someone who I don't have a time chart for, and I have tried to narrow down his date to about November 2nd, 1986, because he hasn't, I've sort of been using news reports to narrow down his date. He's going to have an autobiography published soon, so hopefully his birth date will be in there. But so David Good is the son of an anthropologist named Kenneth Good and a indigenous Yanomami tribe member from Venezuela. And so the story of his life is that his anthropologist father went down to study the Yanomami tribe, which is a much talked about tribe in anthropology, but they're pretty remote, most of them, and they haven't seen many outsiders and things like that. And so his father went down there and ended up staying 12 years instead of a year and a half to study, and ended up marrying one of the local women. took her back to the United States and almost immediately gave birth to their son, David. But she ended up not being able to, after a few years, adjust to life in the United States. And so she went back to live in her tribe. And so as David was growing up, he felt really ashamed and confused about his mom being gone, and that she was like this weird, like, jungle woman, as he said. And he just kind of wanted to put it behind him and told people that his mom was dead. This was such a famous anthropologist and story and book that actually, when David was on a class trip when he was 10, he saw a picture of his mom that his dad had taken in the museum with his whole class there. And he was like mortified because she's naked, and eating tarantulas and things. So this was a major, apparently, as I read his story, this was a major thing in his life where he just had a lot of trouble coming to terms with it. And I really work with the Saturn cycle a lot. And so when he went to, when he was at his Saturn opposition, he ended up drinking a lot, and he was kind of in a bad state, trying to like forget about all of his family background. He was kind of the subject of curiosity at anthropology meetings, and people were like, "Oh, you won a Nintendo 64? What? You're a normal kid?" And he just hated it. And so he said that when he turned about 2021, he decided that he actually wanted to explore this further, and he went back and he finally read his dad's book, and he watched the National Geographic special that his family was in, that he was actually on camera in as a child, and he decided that he wanted to go find his mom. And so so this was during his waning Saturn square, and he took 3 years to save up the money to go visit the Yanomami tribe that his mom was from, and he ended up reuniting with her. So the Saturn and Sag gist of the story is, even though I usually look at people who've already done their Saturn returns because most of the interesting stuff has happened then, this is actually building up to 2 weeks before Saturn went into Sagittarius in December. He founded his nonprofit status, was accepted for basically a nonprofit to work between building a bridge between indigenous people in Venezuela and Costa Rica, including the Yanomami tribe that his mom belongs to, and outsiders and Westerners, understanding that this is going to be a necessity in the coming years, and that he can't ignore this sort of split background of his, and he's ending up making that actually his life's work now. So this is currently my favorite Saturn and Sagittarius story.
It is good.
Yeah, that really illustrates one of the notions that especially comes up in like people with day charts, but sometimes with night charts as well, but mostly day charts, which is the idea that Saturn is like a sore spot or a weakness or something that the person's really uncomfortable with, especially when they're younger. But then at successive Saturn transits, especially the hard aspects like the squares and the oppositions and the conjunctions, it's something that they grow into and become more comfortable with and sort of adapt themselves to, where it eventually becomes like a strength or sometimes an area of focus where previously it had been something that they kind of shy away from or something like that.
Right. Yeah, he's definitely got a day chart, I'm sure. So yeah, that's currently my favorite one, although I don't have like an exact chart for him. But I have a couple others that do have charts.
Okay, awesome. So we can either alternate back and forth between you and Patrick's example charts, or you could do one more and then we could switch to Patrick. What do you guys want to do?
I'm happy to do one more, but Patrick, if you want to alternate, I'm up for that too.
That's all right. It's fine.
Okay.
Let's give one of Patrick's just because it's funny. Like the two different ones you guys chose are really good. Which do you want to?
Tony Abbott.
Okay.
Tony Abbott. So Tony Abbott is the current Prime Minister of Australia, and he was born with Saturn and Sagittarius. If I bring up the chart. So
oh my lordy, this will be good.
And this is a time chart, I guess.
Yes, it's a time chart. It's A-rated. So you'll see that he was born at night, or before sunrise, rather. So he was born while it was not day, and Saturn is in the 3rd house. And as we know, Saturn tends to be a judge or taskmaster or puts the topics of the sign on trial. So oftentimes when Saturn goes through Sagittarius, we see great efforts and setbacks in areas concerning travel, and that's usually, it comes through, when there's been a lot of very significant construction projects that connect people from A to B, so highways, bridges, even space travel. Like for example, NASA was Saturn was in Sagittarius, and there's often been religious controversies during Saturn Sagittarius, including Galileo's trial and Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the door.
Also, Mussolini and the Pope reintroducing, bringing peace between Vatican City and Italy.
Yeah, and
that was Saturn and Sag.
Yeah, so and then of course last time there was the satanic versus controversy.
Right.
But anyway, so I say all this to bring this to attention with Saturn in his third. At the time of his Saturn return, he was actually in a seminary. He was studying to become a priest. So obviously we have this third house association of schooling. And it's in Sagittarius with Jupiter, and so that gives you the kind of priestly or religious philosophical connotations. He was writing articles for the Catholic newspaper being distributed at his seminary, and but he got to about 29 years old. Just after he turned 29 years old, he says in his biography, if I may quote, in his autobiography, he said, at about this time, talking about late 1987, late 1986, he says, at about this time, my yearning for the wider world was being fanned by the Catholic labor stalwart Jonah Johnson, who on a number of occasions invited me to dinners, blah, 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 blah. Back at the seminary again after my pastoral year, looking for a diversion on a sleepy afternoon, I phoned a university rugby friend only to be told that a get-together the following week would have to be postponed because he was going to London to sign a multi-billion-dollar contract. That was the moment I irrevocably concluded that a 29-year-old former Rhodes Scholar writing 500-word essays in the company of uncertain youths and middle-aged nuns was not making the most of my life. So basically he got tired of being a priest. He got tired of being a seminarian. He thought that wasn't the life for me. I have to be a politician. Like, this is what I have to really make something, I have to put my life to good use. So he says in early 1987, I don't know exactly what date that would have been, but Saturn in that time from December 1st to March of 1987, he had completed a Saturn return, in his third house. So he left the seminary over the course of his Saturn return. Shortly afterward, he met a woman who became his wife, and they married when Saturn hit his Venus with Uranus there in 1988. So I thought it was a good example because it demonstrates, I think, it's a good example of Saturn in the sign of Sagittarius as well as the house, and the return to that position, showing him kind of throwing off this this previous dedication. And so I'm not sure what this means for for his next Saturn return, but it will probably evoke some similar theme of throwing off something old, whether maybe that's politics. Maybe politics will be the next thing he finds to be, not what he wants his life to be about. But I guess we'll see. Or maybe that will mature in some way. I'm not sure. Well, let me get back to gallery view here. So at this point, do you want to switch back?
Sure. So,
right.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great example, and it's nice that it's a time chart. And one of the things you pointed out is it ties in really well with the house placement. And I think that's really important. So for people that are there's a lot of people that are getting ready to start their Saturn returns. And, for more interpretive principles, you can listen to the previous show that Lisa and I did that was dedicated to the Saturn return and going through the different topics. But one of the things that Patrick's example really illustrates is that the house that the Saturn placement is located in, the topics associated with that house often become the prime focus during the Saturn return. Although something came up just yesterday, which was Anthony Lewis wrote a post on Sect, and he pointed out Steven Spielberg's chart, which is a really interesting example because it seems to not quite almost match his life in some ways with his Saturn placement, because he has Saturn in the second house in a night chart, and he's worth like $3 billion or something like that. So this brings in, though, or what it brought up actually was an important point about also paying attention to the houses that Saturn rules in the chart, because those houses also will come into play, especially during the course of the Saturn return. So in Steven Spielberg's chart, which I'm trying to bring up really quickly here, he has...
Do you have the data?
Yeah, I've got it right now and sharing the screen. There we go. So there's the chart. And this is a time chart, evidently, from birth certificate. And he has Saturn in the second house in a night chart. And Anthony Lewis was like, well, this doesn't make sense because he has Saturn in the second house in the night chart, which is supposed to be, Saturn in night charts is supposed to be more difficult. So theoretically, it should be a very difficult placement when it comes to his finances. But what's interesting is if you pay attention to the house rulerships, what houses is Saturn ruling?
7 and 8.
Right, exactly. So using the traditional rulerships and using whole sign houses, Saturn is ruling the 7th house and the 8th house. So you'd say, well, has he ever had any, the question that I asked myself when I looked at the chart was like, well, has he ever had any financial problems that were specifically tied into either relationships or marriage or shared finances with other people through the 8th house?
That's
and
right.
If you read his Wikipedia biography, one of the entries I found last night that says explicitly he's currently ranked as having the 3rd most costly celebrity divorce in history. Because when him and his first wife were married in the 1980s, and when they split up in, I think, 1987 through 89, so the tail end of, well, actually, it was 89 when they split up, and Saturn was in Capricorn going through his 7th house. When they split up, they had a prenuptial agreement, but it was invalidated because it was written, the judge invalidated it because it was written on a napkin. And so his wife actually got what was half of his fortune at the time, which came out to somewhere around $100 million. So you have a question where, and this raises an interesting like philosophical and conceptual and interpretive question for astrologers, where you have a placement like this where Saturn is in the 2nd house in a night chart. So it's indicating financial difficulties. It's ruling the 7th and the 8th. So it's showing a connection with relationships or shared finances. And he does have this, what for him at least seems to have been a negative experience where he lost half of his fortune. So just in terms of sometimes interpreting placements as indicating something universal for a person's life versus indicating sometimes what can only be one-off or singular events that will occur at some point in a person's life. I guess that's part of the lesson about this chart.
I'd like to make 2 points.
Sure.
So first, Steven Spielberg makes really expensive movies. If I were investigating that Saturn in the 2nd, I would be in trouble for any projects when it was activated, because that's where it's not his personal finances that are probably a pain for securing the funds to. And then also, I just happened to notice that that Saturn is in the 1st decan of Leo, and Saturn is considered to be the ruler of the 1st decan of Leo. And my fancy book, the symbol that I chose for the 1st decan of Leo was the mask in the spotlight. It seems to be a decan that has a tremendous amount to do with performance. And as far as the principles of decanic dignity, as I'm coming to understand them, what I generally say is that when a planet is in its own decan, it gives excellent results in that tiny sliver of the chart, so that the houses it rules will still suffer, as they obviously do. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, interesting. And that brings up an interesting point that maybe you can comment on, Ben, just in terms of one of the shows I did earlier this year with Michael Ofek was talking about mitigating factors in traditional astrology and how, even though sometimes people have this sort of black and white view of traditional astrology as, you'll have a placement and it'll say something, and if it's like a malefic, it'll just be a horrible extreme delineation and that's the end of it. And so people have this view that traditional astrology is very black and white, but in fact, there's a number of mitigating conditions and factors that are brought into play in traditional delineations that can allow something like a Saturn placement to be mitigated for the better. Could you talk a little bit about that, or what are some conditions that you would look at if you're looking at a person's Saturn placement in order to see if maybe it's better or it's worse than they might think?
Well, one example might be reception. That would be a straightforward thing. If Saturn is, I suppose it doesn't matter what the sign he's in, but especially if he was in detriment, but he was aspecting or looking at the Lord of the house, that could be a factor. There is something that Abu Mashar and others talk about. I think it's largesse and recompense. And basically, if I remember right, it's when a planet is in fall, but it is transited or configured to the Lord of the exaltation of that sign. So it's almost as though it's fallen down and needs help, and along comes someone to save it.
A fairy godmother.
Yeah, so that's that. They talk about those kinds of conditions. It is. I think the topic of mitigating conditions is important, because if you read a lot of traditional material, when they focus on one topic, they'll give you the best, the worst, and the middle interpretations. And then they'll move on to the next topic. But you're never meant to judge something simply in isolation. So you should look for things like mitigating conditions.
Sure, definitely. And I know that was something that came up a lot in your research, Lisa, in terms of Saturn returns in particular, that there were a few specific mitigations that really counted in almost every single chart.
Yeah, basically if Saturn, even if it was in a night chart and therefore would tend to be more difficult than a day chart Saturn or Saturn return, if Saturn was in its own sign, so in Saturn in Capricorn or Saturn in Aquarius, even in a night chart, reception for sure, as you were saying, Ben, and also like overcoming aspects from Jupiter or Venus, regardless of the sect of the chart. So overcoming, for anyone who doesn't know, the overcoming aspect would be Jupiter or Venus in an earlier sign than the Saturn, either from a square or from a trine. Typically, I would look at as being very mitigated. So all three of those conditions seriously improved the sort of performance, I guess you would say, of the Saturn in the chart, even if it was a night chart. And conversely, Mars hitting things, even if Saturn was in a day chart, would kind of make things more difficult.
Okay. So just to do a couple more quick chart examples, what was the other chart example you'd like to look at, Lisa?
Maybe Amanda Knox's.
Okay. So this will actually be an upcoming Saturn return, although her Saturn placement's still relevant.
Yeah, this is another upcoming one. And again, I usually look at more of the ones that are either halfway through or completed because there's more to say about them. But this is such an interesting one, again, because so many things have happened already relevant to the placements. And I'm therefore curious with what's going to actually happen during her Saturn return itself. So this is Amanda Knox. She was a U.S. student who was studying as a foreign exchange student in Italy when her roommate in Italy was murdered in 2007 while she was there studying. So, and she has had a subsequent 7+ year ordeal with the Italian courts, and there were, a couple judgments against her, and then a couple, there was a lot of discussion in the popular media, I'm sure most of you have seen, but maybe not everyone, regarding the fairness of this process legally. But anyway, so when this happened, so she has Saturn in a night chart here in the 7th house, ruling the 8th and the 9th houses. And so that's really interesting to me already. It's kind of a doubled up theme in terms of trouble abroad, Saturn ruling the 9th in particular, and then even the 8th with, the death of her roommate.
Her roommate was murdered.
Yes, her roommate was murdered. And interestingly, with this placement of Saturn in the 7th, although they were both ultimately cleared, initially her and her then boyfriend, Italian boyfriend, were both put up for murder charges. And various of their associates. So Saturn was transiting when this happened through her 4th house of the home, which is interesting because, of course, this happened to her roommate at home. So obviously it's a pretty dark story, but it's interesting to me that was already just the waning square of this Saturn cycle, even before she got to her Saturn return, and it ruling all those topics being really relevant. So one thing that's kind of interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how they interact with each other, these different astrological factors, is, so all things considered, you would expect to see the Saturn return being a little bit more difficult because it being a night chart, and it not really having major mitigations. But one interesting thing I noticed recently, I don't know if you all heard, but she was exonerated by the High Court in Italy earlier this year in the spring, and she was already back in the U.S. But what was interesting to me in particular about this is because you would say, okay, this ordeal is over, but this was still terrible. In the Hellenistic timing technique, zodiacal releasing, she actually, through this whole period, from the time of the murder until the last 7-8 years, she was in the major period highlighting Saturn in her chart. She was in a Sagittarius period, and so it was really highlighting that difficult Saturn. However, early in 2014, she switched into a Capricorn period, which for her is much, much better, and it's the major backdrop that will rule that time period for many years for her, and it highlights the Venus in her chart, which is the benefic of the sect for the night chart. So, and what happened is, there's not time to explain the whole technique, but basically there's a major turning point right now called the loosing of the bond. And this was actually, she was exonerated in March, but just earlier this month, the full judge's opinion was put into the media, and it was pretty scathing. It said there were massive mistakes in the investigation from the very beginning, and that she never should have been charged, basically. And so she's in this really positive period now in zodiacal releasing. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this otherwise sort of difficult Saturn return will look as it's happening once this zodiacal releasing timing technique has switched over to something that's much better for her. So something that I haven't actually looked at as much so far in the Saturn returns. And it'll be interesting to see that mix of factors going on for her.
Okay, awesome. And then Patrick, you've written a really extensive article on Saturn and Sagittarius that covered a lot of different stuff. And you actually have some really amazing chart examples. And which one do you want to focus on? Because I actually want to briefly just show and highlight 2 or 3 of the ones that you aren't going to talk about extensively, but just point out that you had flagged them as Saturn and Sagittarius people. But which one would you like to focus on?
I guess Osama bin Laden.
Okay, yeah, that's one of the more impressive, I think, Saturn and Sagittarius examples. So there's the chart.
So yeah, so we don't have a birth time, and actually there's even some disagreements about the birth date, but regardless, he would still be born with Saturn and Sagittarius, and there seems to be more documented support for this date, March 10th, 1957. Interesting thing about Osama bin Laden and his Saturn is, okay, so obviously the guy has some issues with some Sagittarius topics. I mean, this guy's associated with one of the worst, terrorist attacks from the air. We'll get to that. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Watson, can I interrupt you for 30 seconds? I just had some fun. Okay, so Ben got me really excited about looking at the Aries ingress charts that happen right after a mean conjunction. And so if you look at the 2001 chart, which speaks to the next 20 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So 2 malefics are within a degree of his 2 malefics in this big 20-year chart. In that huge 20-year Aries ingress chart, Saturn is conjunct Algol, which is right on top of Osama's Mars, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's in the United States is first. Then Mars is in the middle of Sagittarius in that 20-year chart, in that 2000.
Wow.
And so Ben's given some talks about how configuration of natal planets to the positions in these big 20-year charts will often result, is often seen in people who play a significant role in the events to come. And so for Osama, it's the 2 malefics. It's just a malefic.
Wow. Yeah. So he's the bad guy of the 20-year period. Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, I guess what happened at his Saturn return. So on April 17th, 1987, he led a group of 50 people to fight against the Soviets at Georgy. And while the Battle of Georgy was kind of an unimportant war, it was in that time, in the midst of his trio of Saturn returns, that he became popular because his leadership in that battle was kind of spun into this image of this charismatic military victor, So that was kind of a defining moment for him, and it was just a year later then, over the course of the Saturn-Uranus opposition, that Al Qaeda was formed. And so
right, because he was like an aristocratic guy that left to go fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets for like ideological purposes, right?
Right. Yeah. So we obviously see some crusading, notions of Sagittarius kind of present in there. And on September 11th, 2001, transiting Saturn was obviously at 14 Gemini, so it was his Saturn opposite Pluto at 12 Sagittarius, so that was on very close to his Saturn. And that was also a Sun-Saturn recurrence for him, so the Sun and Saturn were both square to the same degree that his Sun and Saturn were square each other in his natal chart. Whoops, did I screw something up? All right, there we go. Sorry. Whoops, I didn't mean to press that. So yeah, I think Osama bin Laden is kind of an interesting example of the pitfalls frankly, of religiosity. Because I've noticed during the Saturn Sagittarius periods that we seem to see religious or philosophical or political beliefs be really challenged. And it's interesting because there are a number of Saturn and Sagittarius figures who are kind of well known to be these kind of acerbic critics of religion. And so some of those people, or not just religion, but of a various number of dearly held beliefs. And so some of those people include Neil deGrasse Tyson. And actually, what's interesting about Neil deGrasse Tyson is he was born just like in the same week that NASA began operations. So in a weird way, he's like the personification of NASA. He's like if NASA was a person, and he is very much, kind of in that vein. And NASA, as I mentioned before, itself was started during Saturn and Sagittarius, and obviously NASA was a great effort towards, going where no one had gone before, right? And that's kind of the Sagittarius idea. Sagittarius is a mutable sign. It's going from one place to another, which is why, these transits through Sagittarius often have to do with, great challenges going from A to B. And so in that same Saturn and Sagittarius period, we saw the beginning of the construction of the national interstate highway system here in the United States. And then, of course, during the next Saturn and Sagittarius period, during the 80s, we had Challenger disaster. Sorry, the Challenger.
Challenger
Challenger disaster in last Saturn Sagittarius period. And now that we're coming up to this next Saturn Sagittarius period, it's really interesting because we've already seen a little bit of a preview. Elon Musk is he's the CEO of Tesla and of SpaceX, is a first space tourism company. And they're actually trying to create a platform which a rocket could launch off from, like in the middle of the ocean, and land on again. So so far their tests have failed, but I think we're coming up to another period of sustained effort in trying to kind of expand our boundaries. And it's very Saturn Sagittarius to me. We're trying to make these very hard voyages. He is also Elon Musk is also trying to he's trying to get the Hyperloop train constructed, to take people very rapidly from different areas of the country to another. I think the first one he wants to do is Los Angeles to San Francisco, but that would actually be consistent with previous Saturn Sagittarius periods where, for example, the Paris Metro started during Saturn Sagittarius. The London Underground was started with Saturn Sagittarius. And actually, in this upcoming Saturn Sagittarius period, China has been talking about constructing a tunnel that will go all the way from China to the United States underground. So, this is another, and I think they're gonna start construction on it, I think, during this next Saturn Sagittarius period. So again, it's another really concerted effort to go from one place to another. A very difficult, a bridge that we're trying to build, from one place to another. So
sure.
So some of my other sort of philosophical critics of with Saturn Sagittarius include Stephen Fry, who's born with Saturn Sagittarius. He kind of got in hot water a little while ago because he said he would tell God to sod off if he ever met God when he died. And Bill Maher was born with Saturn Sagittarius, and he's a very prominent critic of various modes of philosophical thought. And then one of our favorites, James Randi, was born with Saturn Sagittarius. Now, he apparently has a time chart, but we don't know how much to actually trust it. But the time chart does put Saturn on his descendant. And
I've looked at some of his transits. It really does work as a chart. I know he should be treated with suspicion.
Yeah.
The trickster.
Just because he's known to, or he says that he gives out the wrong time. I think he's said at one point in order to test people, so that if somebody finally actually gets the right time, that'll mean something to him. But let's not go into his details of biography right now. But that is a really great example, and you can kind of see the themes coming up with some of these different examples that Patrick is going through and Lisa's going through.
That was fantastic. Can I just ask? Can you put Neil deGrasse Tyson up just for a second?
Yeah. I
just want to know.
And this is not a time chart.
This is not a time chart, but who wants to break it to Dr. Tyson that he's a week away from being a Bardo baby?
He would love to hear that, I think.
He's got membership in the club.
He'd probably be cool with that.
I don't know about that.
Maybe. Oh, that's interesting. He is Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, and we have the opposition going on right now. Oh, by the way, slightly unrelated, although we may see something kind of interesting happen with him. Kanye West, was born with the Sun conjunct Jupiter opposite Neptune. And
speaking of brilliant astrophysicists.
And so, so Saturn, right. So Saturn and Sagittarius will oppose Kanye. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on Kanye with this Saturn transit. And actually, it's kind of funny. He recently announced that he was going to run for president in a speech he made at the VMAs where he was kind of drunk. And I noticed that it was actually a fantastic recurrence transit because he was born with the Sun conjunct Jupiter opposite Neptune. And on that night, it was Sun conjunct Jupiter opposite Neptune.
Bravo.
Not only that, but he was also born with Venus conjunct Mars. And at the time, Venus was conjunct Mars as well. It was a brilliant confluence.
I love astrology. I love it.
I love it. You on Kanye Watch 2015.
You need that birth time, seriously.
All right. That is something. This is a good example because we're using some celebrity charts here.
But we're going to need your birth time, Kanye.
We talked about this recently on a show where we just need more celebrity birth times. Like the previous generation of astrologers, they were awesome at going up to celebrities and at least making the attempt to get birth times. And while they weren't always successful, just the fact that they were taking more shots at it meant that we have a lot more birth times for celebrities and prominent and important movers and shakers from a few decades ago than we do for now. So one of the things I hope people take away from the podcast and this webinar is the need to do more to try and go out there and get birth times that we can look at interesting and important examples like this, because it teaches us something about the nature of astrology and lets us improve on the techniques. So, okay, Nick, just very briefly, do you have any good Saturn and Sagittarius examples or things off the top of your head before we, just concise ones before we move on to the next section?
Oh, I mean, I know a bunch of little biographical examples.
Of course you do, human ephemeris.
One funny one, Tom Waits is a Sagittarius, and right when Saturn was in Sagittarius in 1988, during a Mercury retrograde in Libra, as it happens, Tom Waits heard someone imitating his voice in a Frito-Lay's commercial, and he wound up suing, I think that's the right chip company, one of the potato chip companies, I'm pretty sure it's Frito-Lay. And he sued them and eventually sort of won the right to the sound of his voice, which was, there was a sort of, precedent, a legal precedent set in that. But it's I think, a funny story of sort of seeing someone badly imitate a poor representation of yourself, or, reputation.
Sure.
Related matter, Saturn, Sun, that kind of thing.
All right.
That's
awesome.
The first one that comes to mind anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So Tuesday we'll do the full Saturn and Sagittarius show. So there'll be a lot more extended discussion of this than what we got into today. Okay. So let's move on to the next section, which is one of our last sections, which is just a topic of discussion that came up recently that Lisa and I talked about, which is the concept of detriment, because this is something I've been working on for the past few years, or at least thinking about, because it doesn't get clearly defined or used, the concept of detriment, in the early Hellenistic tradition. So what that means is for the first few hundred years of the practice of Western astrology, they don't really define it in the introductory textbooks, and therefore they don't really have a term for it. So eventually, at some point, Rhetorius starts using it around the 7th century, and he refers to it as like contrariety or something like that. He uses the term enantioma, which just means to be opposite or opposed to something, essentially. So it's not really clear that it's like a term that's describing the effect so much as it's almost just like a term describing that the planet's in the opposite sign from its domicile. And this raises an issue lately where I've been trying to figure out what term should be used for this concept, if we should retain the term that came to be used in English, which is detriment, or if we should try and develop or invent a new term which encapsulates the concept. One of the ideas that I came up with was referring to it as antithesis for some reason, although that sounds kind of clunky to me, so I'm not sure that it could actually take off in practice, but at least conceptually it conveys part of the meaning of the concept. And then more recently, one of the students of my Hellenistic course was using the term exile to refer to detriment. And it'd been a while since I had heard that, because I don't hear it used that often in English, but it got me interested in the source and origins of that, and that is a possible term that could be used for this concept, because obviously exile, if a planet in its own sign in ancient astrology was originally conceptualized as a planet in its domicile, and a planet that's in a sign other than the ones that it owns is conceptualized as a planet being away from its domicile or away from home, then the concept of exile does seem to be like an extension of the same conceptual range if we're referring to detriment as exile, so that it's not just away from home, but there's some sort of negative connotation to it, that there's something problematic about it because it's not at home, but it's also not quite happy about it. So this is a topic actually I thought Ben would be good to bring on, because you're actually translating some of the Arabic texts right now from the earliest strata of the medieval tradition, and that's where the concept gets defined, I think, the most clearly early on, and you start getting some of the original attempts to give it a technical term in Arabic. So what were some of the terms that they used to refer to it, or what was the conceptual sort of implication of some of that?
Well, like the Hellenistic astrologers, they did not pay a lot of attention to detriment in their standard lists of bad conditions. They would always mention being in fall. That was a typical one. But they would rarely mention being in detriment, and yet they referred to it as a negative thing. And several times I've come across the Arabic word wabal. And Arabic is interesting because Arabic words are organized by roots, and each root refers to some kind of primal experience or kind of event or action. You can sort of trace the meaning of what's the thought behind a particular word. And so this wabal comes from a word, the verb wabala, which means to rain really heavily. And some of the derivative terms have to do with sickness and unhealthiness, especially like bad air. And I'm thinking, so if you're thinking maybe, what is it when you're trying to camp out in a really swampy area, you have to watch out for things like cholera and disease and this kind of thing.
Miasma.
Miasma theory, bad air. And so wabal means unhealthiness and disease. And to my mind, one way to look at it is that if a planet is in its own sign, in its own house, it has a sort of coherence and balance to it. But if it's in the opposite sign, there is a sense of disintegration, imbalance, unhealthiness. And of course, this goes back to all of the old medical theories where health is a matter of balance. And so two things. One is that when a planet is in detriment, it generally shows things that are less organized, that are falling apart. It may show a kind of event, or you're trying to do something that you might be successful with eventually, but you have to juggle a lot of moving parts. So there's a sense of disorganization. But I have also seen, especially with the lot of marriage, the Hermes lot of marriage, that if the Lord of the lot of marriage is in its detriment, the native often meets partners while on vacation. They're traveling away from home. So that the travel metaphor...
Speaking of marriage, I actually have to go. I really promised I was going to be on it for 90 minutes, so I'm afraid I have to leave prematurely. But I will see all you next time, and I think you guys are really awesome. And I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar as much as I did. All right, have a good day.
Thanks for joining, Patrick.
Bye, Patrick.
See you later. All right.
So there is a bit of that idea of travel that you can see, you can experience in a chart. But I think that this idea of wabal or unhealthiness, although I don't like it as a word, because it leads to too many complicated connotations. It does seem to capture this sense of imbalance, not working properly, and that sort of thing.
Sure. So what would be your vote in terms of the English term that we should use for like common day practice?
Well, I like the term exile, and I can't remember if you mentioned it. I haven't had a problem with using detriment, but if we had to choose, Moran's word, exile, makes a lot of sense.
And this is because when we were talking about this, it seems like Moran is the one, and the student of mine, where I asked her where she got it from, she said Moran was the one that used it, and that seems to be the source of it. One thing that I found was interesting once Lisa and I recorded that show and that discussion is that a couple of listeners from both Spanish-speaking countries and Portuguese-speaking countries both said that exile is the common term used in Spanish and in Portuguese for detriment. So I thought that was kind of interesting that at least in those languages it carried over. And I don't know if that's because of Moran or if that's because of whoever he got it from.
There must be some other Renaissance sources that he got that from somehow.
Sure.
Because I haven't seen that word. There is one example which we have talked about in Saul's book of 50 Judgments or 50 Anecdotes, where he embeds this sentence within a discussion about being peregrine. And he talks about a planet being in exile. And it's hard to tell whether he's talking about a planet in detriment or a planet that's peregrine in that sentence. And because he isn't clearer and doesn't, and because it's embedded in the discussion of being peregrine, it's hard to know what he means. Because in Arabic, their word for peregrine, like in Latin, is the word for foreigner. So a peregrine planet, they would call it a foreign planet. But in this one sentence, he said, if a planet is in exile, and I can't be 100% sure whether he means peregrine or detriment.
Okay.
But there might be others out there who start to use that term of exile for this.
Sure. And what, because I think I misquoted it in the podcast, but what passage of Saul is that from? Do you remember? It's like 41, Judgment 41.
Let's see. I'm pulling it up now.
Okay. And or Kelly, did you have something?
I was just going to very quickly, that's really interesting because my previous understanding had associated that word exile more with the concept of peregrine or peregrine. So that's really interesting that there is this potential ambiguity in the translation where it may actually apply equally or more so to the concept of detriment.
It's in the 41st Judgment, and it says, and if a planet was in exile, it makes it and its nature bad.
Okay, that's specific.
Now, very clear.
But what to make it even more, and then it goes on to say, and if it was in something other than its own house or exaltation, blah blah blah. So it's hard to know what he means. I will point out that this word for exile comes from the same root as what they use for foreigner. So.
Sure.
Until we find more sources for this kind of word, it'll be hard to know where someone like Moran might have gotten exile from.
Sure. And Austin, you had, when I started going down this track of like exile, you actually had some good objections in terms of like the conceptual direction that was headed by focusing on a term like exile, and that it maybe overlooks another direction you could go with it or another interpretive sort of feature of planets in detriment, right?
I think so.
So how does all this exile talk sit with you, or where would you go with that?
Okay, so 2 points. One, the reason antithesis doesn't work is antithesis is noun. It's not descriptive. Something can't be in antithesis. That's why it sounds awkward.
Yeah.
Something can't be in thesis. Something can be a thesis. The other, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about detriment because of Jupiter's recent movement into Virgo. And I don't know, what I've noticed is that it's not that the planet's action is completely ceases and it doesn't. But what I've noticed is that planets in detriment almost masquerade as the ruler of the sign in which they are placed. They're so out of sorts. They are a stranger in a strange land. And Jupiter in Jupiter in Virgo, for example, kind of tries to pretend to be Mercury. And it actually, in the case of a benefic like Jupiter, it seems to be beneficial, but all of the beneficial things that I've noted with Jupiter and Virgo, they're just mercurial things, and they're actually in many ways deleterious or contrary to Jupiter's core significations. And so, because the idea, there's a general economy to astrology, and the idea that a planet would just sort of cease to be or cease to do anything is contrary to that. So I've been experimenting with this idea of seeing it as sort of masquerading, as a native in a land in which it is quite foreign, and that being to its own detriment, but being, if it's a benefic, helpful to the sign which, or the planet which rules the sign in which it is placed.
Well, in a way, Austin, that brings back, since a planet since there is an opposition between planets that rule opposite signs, in a way that brings us back to the idea of antithesis. If Mercury, if Jupiter is in Gemini, then he's going to, and if he acts kind of mercurial, then in a way he's masquerading as his antithesis. I mean, so you could bring it back to that term. I wouldn't say that a planet ceases its activity, and I hope I didn't get that impression. It's just that it's more disorganized and harder to bring about in the way that you want to.
Yeah, so Ben, I didn't mean to imply that you were stating that a detriment erases the planet's power, but that seems to be an underlying assumption when I hear a lot of astrologers talk about detriment. And I also wasn't saying that antithesis is conceptually wrong. It's just literally the wrong part of language. It's a noun.
The grammar.
A better term to
grammar
describe
police.
it. And then Nikki, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think in terms of the idea of it being a masquerade, I think any planet sort of masquerades as the ruling planet of a sign when it occupies a sign. It's just that when it is occupying a quote-unquote detriment sign, and I do really like exile, by the way, as well, when it is occupying that sign, then it is masquerading as a planet that is conceptually an opposite of sorts. So Venus and Mars are opposites. Saturn is a sort of opposite to the sun and moon, the absence of light to the lights, and Mercury and Jupiter. So that's what I do like about Austin's analogies. Yeah, certainly Jupiter's pretending to be Mercury, which is just absolutely un-Jupiterian of it to do.
Right. Sometimes they have a harder time pulling it off. They have a harder time, like what's the term, like passing for Mercury has a harder time passing for Jupiter rather than some other planet.
Right. Yeah, Mercury can maybe act like Saturn or act like the sun a little easier than it can act like Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So go ahead, Ben.
In terms of, if we're thinking about the opposition, can you all hear me?
Yeah, just cut off.
Okay, I got a sign that said my connection was unstable. Okay.
Well, that's detriment.
When you talk about when you talk about exaltation and fall, you're talking about a scale of value, and both exaltation and fall as words make sense together. And when you're talking about being in its own house versus detriment doesn't really capture it, but exile does, and you're talking about a scale of being or a scale of organization. And so exile makes a lot of sense to me, and it does bring out the idea of an opposition, an opposite.
Sure. So I guess the challenge here is just either go with exile, or somebody come up with a better term that conveys similar connotations, but maybe isn't like as extreme. Because exile, we're going to have a hard time for some astrologers. That's going to be a hard sell for some people.
Disorganized.
From now on, when someone says detriment, we just look at them like
like they're in exile.
Yeah.
So either we do exile or pick a different term that has, similar meanings, or find something like antithesis, but find, like Austin is suggesting, a better term that actually works to convey that concept, if we can find such a term. So I don't know what's going to happen in 5 minutes here. This webinar is scheduled to end, and I'm actually not clear, because I haven't done this before, if it's going to cut us all off exactly at that time, or if it'll just let us keep going. So this is going to be a surprise in 5 minutes, and I know we're getting up here to 2 hours, so we want to start wrapping this up anyways.
Maybe we could look at some questions if there are any.
Yeah.
But let me ask you quickly, Chris. So are you throwing down the gauntlet? Are you declaring now that unless someone comes up with a better word, that you're going to start using exile soon?
No, I'm saying, well, I'm going to start using something soon. I'm saying like we're choosing language here, and we're on the forefront of like reviving ancient astrology. But part of what comes along with that is we're getting to pick some of the specific technical terms that most, subsequent generations of astrologers are going to use. And I want to be very deliberate about that and very conscious about it. But I also want to do it, and I want to just not keep using old terms because that's the revived tradition, but instead be very conscious about using things that are evocative of the conceptual meaning and that convey the conceptual meaning, because that's what they did in the Hellenistic and medieval and other traditions, is they picked terms in whatever their contemporary language was that matched and was evocative of the concept. So we have to do the same thing now. And I think this is like a good community or an example where we can sort of crowdsource it and all come to some decision about what would be the most appropriate term to use. So
perhaps you could say that the planet was studying abroad.
Studying abroad. Yeah, that's pretty good. If we could maybe with some hyphens.
Working as an au pair.
Yeah.
Right.
I like disorganized. I like disorganized because I think it captures that the pure energy of the planet is not functioning to its best potential.
Sure. Well, that would be a good poll right now, and I would start that poll. But maybe for one of our next chat discussions, we can have a poll on that, or maybe I can do it on the podcast or something. Yeah. So, okay. Somebody actually, Raul Develia suggested alien, which is one of the terms kind of used in Hellenistic astrology for certain planets. But anyways, so let's move on and do a little bit of Q&A before we either get cut off or wrap this session up. Does anybody have any broad general questions about things we've discussed here today that might be good to bring to the panel? Are any of the other speakers seeing good questions or things that you want to address?
I see someone suggested a word that goes along with this Wabal disease idea, and Freeman Presson suggests malaise. I think that's an interesting idea.
A planet is in malaise.
It's in its malaise. We're suffering malaise.
Okay.
It's asleep on the job.
Linda Johnson suggests peripatetic, traveling, roaming, wandering, nomadic, drifting, rootless as meanings for peripatetic.
Wandering would be more like peregrine.
Yeah, that's so close.
Yeah.
It's very close. Same with alien. A lot of the alien from the Latin text, they will sometimes say alien, but that also just means a foreigner. So that could be easily confused with being peregrine.
Somebody suggested expatriate, which I also think is hilarious and appropriate. I mean, Ben, I think that what you were saying about fall and exaltation both being on a scale of height and depth and needing
value,
needing that same sort of conceptual continuity for rulership and detriment is really important. They are literally a spectrum. They are a line from rulership to the opposition to that rulership.
Sure.
So it's like ruler and subject.
Yeah.
Not quite.
No, it's like ruler, and then it's the opposite kingdom that has the totally different values, right? Like,
got it.
Virgo is not the subject of Pisces.
And then finally, since we're up to the last moment, Linda Shinjin, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, suggested rebel. So, okay, we might want to wrap this up now since I don't see any broader questions and I don't know if we'll get caught off. So I'm just going to say, in case it does catch us off, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to make this a monthly thing. It'll have different panelists each time, depending on how many different people I can rope into doing this, like I did this time at the last minute. But people that are signed up for the Patreon, to be a Patreon supporter at the $5 and $10 tiers, will get access to it each month, as well as a bunch of other benefits as part of the podcast. So if you liked this and you want to join us again next time, then you should sign up at that $5 or $10 tier, and then you'll be able to join us. And perhaps some of the Patreon people are going to be able to join us on camera perhaps next time to have some more interactions. I think these meetings are going to tend to be a little bit smaller in future discussions, so that some of them might be more like hangouts where we have a group of people to chat and look at charts and have sort of study sessions, things like that. But we're still experimenting with the format, so we'll see what works best and sort of go from there. Okay, the clock just struck 3 and it didn't like end magically.
Didn't explode.
Right.
It's actually just been 2 really good questions come up.
Oh no!
I don't know.
We lost Nick.
Did we?
It's fading into the background.
So you noticed a couple good questions, Kelly?
Yeah, 2. I'm not going to try and pronounce this person's name because I will butcher it, so I apologize, but I'm going to read your question out. Can you touch on planets under the rays of the sun, so combustion, especially if they're in their domicile? For example, Sun conjunct Mercury in Gemini or Sun conjunct Mars in Scorpio?
That
was a really good question.
Sure. I mean, I think that would...
I have one thought on that. I've done a little side study. People with the Sun and Mars conjunct in Taurus include some very notable examples. Pete Seeger, the folk musician and political activist rather, who he was certainly a pacifist, at least until the Second World War. What he's also famous for is cutting off the electricity when Bob Dylan was trying to play electric at the Newport Festival. And it's interesting to me because later there was a musician named Jonathan Richman who also had that conjunction. And he was also he was a rock musician who decided like the loud noise of electronic guitars and what have you was too damaging. Something about the Sun-Mars conjunction in Taurus being, having this Mars being in exile and that relating to the violence of sound, and the violence is sort of it's facets of violence that we don't necessarily typically think of, a heightened sensitivity to that kind of thing. So, and 2 of the Jacksons, Janet Jackson and Jermaine Jackson, are both Sun-Mars in Taurus, and I could go on and on about that. But I have, to answer the question, I've noticed definitely a Sun-Mars conjunction in Taurus person is very different than the sort of horoscope you'll get if you have Sun-Mars in Scorpio.
Well, do you have examples of the Sun-Mars in Scorpio or Aries, Nick, where the Mars is in domicile? Or
I can if I get out of...
Or does anyone else have a comment on that? Because that was the question, I guess, was about does that sort of mitigate the combustion if the planet's in its own sign?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the Hellenistic rules, was a planet in its own domicile or exaltation, or they said also term, is mitigated from being under the beams and is not harmed by it. And I definitely have seen that be the case, where you'll see, especially in prominent people's charts, even when they have a planet under the beams, like it doesn't seem to be affected the same way if it's in its own domicile or exaltation as if the planet was just in any other sign.
Cool. So that's like a mitigating factor there to answer that person's.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I would
someone
add
like
to that.
Gloria Steinem is an example of someone who has the Sun and Mars in Aries.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Whereas, let's see, in Scorpio, just off the top of my database, we could say... Minnie Marx, the mother of the Marx Brothers, basically the matriarch who created the Marx Brothers. That's a good one. Joseph Goebbels is another one. Let's say that's a darker side of Sun Mars. And a couple of, there's a bunch of good ones here, but we just don't have the time to cover.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, we should probably wrap this up. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to all of our panelists. I really appreciate you guys. We're on the forefront of new technological vistas. So thank you all for going boldly where no one has gone before with me for this Sunday afternoon. Thanks to the people that have already signed up. Already a couple of Patreon subscribers have signed up. Suze Carter and Freeman Presson both have joined making $5 pledges through Patreon. So thanks to both of you, and anybody else that wants to join us in the future. That's all you have to do is sign up by Patreon. You get a bunch of benefits, and this is one of the benefits that you'll get, is the ability to join us probably again on a Sunday afternoon towards the end of each month. We'll do one of these, and it'll be a different format, but something similar to this. So thanks everyone for listening to the podcast. You can find out more at theastrologypodcast.com, and you can find out more about each of our panelists by going to their websites, which are I mentioned at the beginning of this, but also I'll list when this is uploaded to YouTube. I also, since I have everybody's email address who signed up for this, I'll send out an email. Nora Stone suggested sending out like an email to everybody to send out the websites for everybody, the link to the Patreon, and some other follow-up stuff. So I'll do that so that everybody can, if you like to speak or hear, you can go to their website or what have you. So I think everyone here does consultations and classes, so you can also get consultations with any of the people on this panel or sign up for many of their classes. So yeah, I think that's it. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks panelists for being on the panel.
Thanks for putting it together, Chris.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah,
Chris.
good work, Chris.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, this is awesome. I think this went really well compared to how it could have gone for the first time, and it was fun. All right, well, I'm going to stop the recording now.